done? Are you done? Are we done with this? Happy 8 years. Happy 8 years.
You would not believe how many couples I have come into my office for marriage counseling, for premarital counseling, or couple counseling that deal with this exact situation. Okay, not the deer hunting portion, but it is something very similar. It's what we call the expectation versus reality principle, okay? And that is that you go into a relationship hoping that it leads to marriage, but doing so, you have expectations that have been built up throughout the years. Maybe it's because of how you saw your parents and how their marriage worked. You have certain expectations of who will do what, when they will do it, and how it will be done, right? So you have expectations like that. You might have really unrealistic expectations, right? That dinner is on the table promptly at 5 p.m. Your slippers are waiting for you when you walk through the door. There is a newspaper handed to you, and you get a drink as you walk in the door, right? Yeah, why are y'all laughing? Some of y'all really had that expectation, didn't you? Yeah. You might have things like that, but here's the problem. That doesn't tend to be how it works out, does it? We've all had expectations. And the majority of the time, they tend to be unrealistic because we just don't know. We haven't been there yet. We haven't made it to marriage. We haven't been in that experience long enough yet. So we bring all these expectations, and when they're not met, how do we end up feeling? Feel cheated, feel angry, feel like we deserve better. One of the most popular sayings I have when I have people that are in my office or otherwise for counseling is, I'm just not happy. We have an expectation that marriage will always be happy. And I will always be happy, and I always deserve to be happy. You see, the problem is when the reality doesn't meet the expectation, we tend to feel cheated. And then we end up feeling sad or miserable or even angry. Now, I can tell you in my own marriage, in my own relationship, I came into this with some expectations. The hunting one was not one of them. When I went into my marriage, in fact, I did not want anybody going hunting with me. That was my time of quiet and solace, okay? And if you know my wife, that wasn't going to happen anyway. I knew that from the first date, right? And my wife had some expectations of me. Now, because of the sake of our marriage, I will tell you I met all of them. And I am doing great so far. And next week I'm going to preach on lying. But we have these expectations that we set up. And when they're not met, often we are upset. We feel like something wasn't fair. Like we are owed something. And as a result, a lot of times people end up becoming more and more angry or bitter or miserable with one another. And then we get to a very difficult time where they want to call it quits, or it's just not working out anymore. In other words, what we've done is we've lost the value we see in a person, in that marriage, because we're not getting what we expected out of it. And if you talk to most counselors now, they will give different reasons why divorce happens, why we see it happen. You know, some of the top reasons you hear for divorce are things like finances, unfaithfulness, addictions. But if you really get down to the root of it, one of the biggest things that a study that I recently read showed is that most of the time, the core of the problem isn't those things. Those are symptoms. The core of the problem is a consumeristic mindset, especially in our culture. We have a consumeristic mindset, and that plays into our marriage. Now, why is that, or what is that? In our culture, we have been taught that if I agree to anything, or I purchase anything, or I make some kind of commitment, I'm doing that because for some reason there's something I'm going to get out of it. I'm going to get something out of this. And with that consumeristic mindset, what we tell ourselves is, I'm going to get fulfillment, I'm going to get happiness, I'm going to get all the things I want. My expectations are going to be met. That's a consumeristic mindset. And it's at the core of most divorces. In fact, I would say it's at the core of the majority of divorces, that someone thinks they're owed something. And when it's not met or when they're not getting anything else out of it, then they see no value in the partnership anymore. They see no value in marriage. To be honest, over 20 to 25% of marriages will end in divorce. Now that number sounds kind of low if you think about our culture, and the reason it sounds low is because that's actually in Christian households. 20 to 25% of people in Christian households will end up in divorce. If you think about it that way, that's pretty high. But in a secular standpoint, you are more likely to have 2 marriages in your lifetime. That is the norm now, to have 2 marriages, not 1, which shows you that we continue to see less and less value in marriage. And it's odd because of this consumeristic mindset. We think it's about what we get out of it. But if you look throughout history, if you look in Scripture, you will notice that marriage really isn't about what we get out of it. It's about what we gain together. Together, we are more fulfilled and we're more able and prepared to do more things in ministry or our call that God has put before us. That's what marriage does. It binds us together. Now, I want you to hear me when I say this. If you're not called to be married, and there are some people that are not, that doesn't mean that you have lost value or you don't have value. In fact, Paul says you are called to a higher standard and to a higher value in a sense for what you are called to. But for those that are called to marriage, the value in marriage is supposed to be what we find together in fulfillment and what God helps us to fulfill in each other. But we've lost that along the way. And it's sad because we see this rising problem of a devalue in marriage. Now, throughout this year, we started out the year saying that as a church, our new vision is to help people understand their value, to help them find it in God's truth. And that's great. But that means that if we're going to do that, we also need to understand the value that's in marriage, what it's actually about, and what fulfillment we gain and what God has prepared it for. And so I want us to spend time looking at that and how do we begin to combat this consumeristic mindset, because it's ingrained in us for years that if we're not getting something out of it, then it doesn't have value, and we've got to change that. If we're going to see those numbers go down in the Christian faith, if we're going to see those numbers go down in the world, that has to change. But for that to happen, for us to see the value in marriage, we first have to understand our value and where it comes from as individuals. So over the next couple of weeks, that's what I want us to look at together. Where does our value come from, and how does that make it so that our marriage has value? And it goes beyond whether I'm just happy or my expectations are met or not, that there's more to it than that. So to do that, we're going to start this morning by looking at husbands and where their value comes from. Where does the husband or a man's value come from? Now, before any of the ladies get upset and say, well, why is it we always start with the man? Listen, give me a break. Next week is Mother's Day. I'm just trying to align things nicely, okay? We will get to the ladies. Ladies, you have just as much value, and we're going to talk about where your value comes to. But I think today we're going to start with the guys. And to be honest, most guys do not see or feel like they have worth. And some of you may even be sitting there saying, well, you don't know my husband. He thinks quite a bit about himself. You know what's sad? Men are really good at putting on that face that we think a lot about ourselves. But honestly, men really struggle to feel like they have any worth. Why? Or how do we know that? Well, maybe it's because of the way we've seen it or the way we've been treated. Maybe it's in our job. We've been told we don't have worth. Maybe it's because of our education. We feel like we failed and we don't have worth. Maybe it's because of a parent who told us you're worthless. Maybe it's because of a spouse that we married who still doesn't see any worth in us. Or maybe it's just the image we have put on ourselves. But this is a real problem for guys. And this isn't some kind of pity party. It's not meant to make us feel bad for our husbands or feel bad for men. But the truth is, a lot of things in our culture tell you that men are just a product, or they have no value or no worth. If you don't believe me, look at the gauges or the boundaries that are put on guys on a way they should act and they have to act. We continue to change that and redefine it. And each year it's like a new study comes out on what a man should be. No wonder it's hard to find their worth. Maybe it's because of television or movies where one guy after another looks like some kind of incompetent idiot who can't do anything. And we laugh at it and we say it's funny, but yet that's a man who doesn't see his worth. And then we're told by friends and spouses, you need to be a better husband. Sir Franz Liszt is quoted as saying this about men: real men are sadly lacking in this world. For when they are put to the test, they prove worthless. You want to know why men have trouble seeing their value? Because of the test. Now, we should know what that test is, right? That's that the man has to pull up and has to pull it all together when things are tough. That's the test. Maybe that's how you define the test, but the truth is the test is different for each man. Whether they were good enough for their father, whether they were good enough for a job, whether they were good enough to bring in the income, whether they were good enough in a decision they made. Each test looks different for each guy, so it's really hard for there to be real men of value when they don't know what the test is. Or they're told by the world over and over again, you failed. And so we go looking for worth. And we're hurting because we can't find that worth. Maybe it's because of the words we hear from family or from our spouse that we messed up again. You weren't good enough. You didn't hold on long enough. You didn't face the problem strong enough. Where do men find value? Where do they begin to find that? Well, that's something that I think we've got to answer. Because if our marriages are going to ever have any value, husbands, you have to know that your value doesn't come from any test. It doesn't come from anything the world says. It doesn't come from anything that you're hearing from anybody else. It comes from one place. And so we're going to discover that today through a man named Boaz. And maybe you know Boaz or maybe you don't. But the story of Boaz is the story of a man who understood his value. And by the world's standards, he would be looked at as having value, but that's not where he saw his value coming from. And we're going to be looking throughout his story today. Now, the good news about his story is we're going to flip around a lot, but his story is all in one place. His story is in the book of Ruth. And if you've got your Bible with you, you can go ahead and look to the book of Ruth. But as you're getting there, let me kind of give you a Sparks Notes version, or Cliff Notes version, I guess would be the correct thing. Sparks Notes or Cliff Notes version of the book of Ruth. Now, what's the story of Ruth all about? Ruth is a woman who is now a widow. At the beginning of her story, her mother-in-law tells her, you can leave me. Go make a new life for yourself. Ruth says, no, I'm going to commit to you. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Ruth does a great act of love by saying that she will become a Jew, basically. That she will convert to Judaism. She will follow her mother-in-law, and they will go through this life together. But there's a problem. Both of these women, in society standards, have lost their value. Why? Because there's no one to care for them. They need what's called a redeemer, a man in their family or connected to their family that will be willing to take them in, cover them as far as taking care of them, provide for their needs, offer them housing, security, all of these things. And so they go to this land, to Naomi's homeland. There are some redeemers there, and one of those redeemers is Boaz. Now, what's interesting about Boaz is his name, Boaz, actually means strength. It actually means strength. What a great thing to name your kid, right? The definition of strength is Boaz. But now that strength could come from a lot of different places. It could be defined in a lot of different ways. But what we will see in Boaz's story is that his value, his strength, all of those things, it did not come from the world's standards. It came from somewhere else. So if you've got your Bibles, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. And this is the first thing we hear about this character, Boaz. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character. He was from Elimelech's family. His name was Boaz. Now, right off the bat, the first time we hear this description of Boaz, what we notice is that he is a man of prominent understanding. He is seen with prominence, noble character. Now, in some translations, you're going to see a man of substance or a man of standing. But no matter how you define this, this means that this man was seen as having worth. Now, if we were to put that in today's terms, and I said to you, how would you define if a man had worth or value? You know, there are a lot of different ways. Or if we said there was a man of prominence, how would we define it? Well, most of us, by world standards, might look at it and say, well, does he have a good job? Is he secure? Is he well known in a community? Does he have wealth? Does he have security for the next several years? Those are things that we define as a man of prominence or substance. But Boaz, while he has those things, there's something more there. You see, Boaz is wealthy at some level. He owns vineyards, he has workers, he has people under him, he has power, he's known in the community, but that's not what seems to define him. Because there's something else said about him, that he is of noble character. There's something king-like about him, royal about him, which means that his value came from somewhere else. His value came from God. In other words, we know that Boaz saw value in God. Now, how do we know that? Well, as you skip through Boaz's story, there's at least 3 instances that are very similar that I want to look at just real quick. We're going to go through them together, so get ready to flip. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 2, verse 4. This is one of Boaz's first interactions after we learn about who he is. This is what's written about him. Later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied. That's one of the interactions. Okay, hold on to that. Skip over to verses 12 through 13, same chapter, Ruth chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. Look at this interaction he then has with Ruth, the character Ruth. "May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. My Lord," she said, "I have found favor with you. For you have comforted and encouraged your servant, although I am not like one of your female servants." There's one more text. Ruth chapter 3, verses 9 through 10. Ruth chapter 3, verses 9 through 10. Flip over there. Listen to the similarities as the other 2 we just read. "So he asked, 'Who are you?' 'I am Ruth, your servant,' she replied. 'Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer.' And then he said, 'May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before, because you have not pursued younger men, whether rich or poor.'" What is it that tells us that Boaz values God and that he knows his worth? How do we begin to see that? In each one of these circumstances, notice that Boaz starts with a blessing. Or somewhere in that interaction, whether it's with servants, family, or whether it's with Ruth, what we see is a blessing that he is asking upon them. Now, he could say, "I give you my blessing," or "I could shower you with gifts and honor," but that's not what he does. He points to God. This is a request on behalf of Boaz to God to bless this individual. And that's a powerful thing, because it tells us that he knows out of all the things he could give to them, the greatest thing he could give them is a blessing from God. That's one of the highest things he could possibly give to him. No matter what he could provide, no matter what he could do, he knows that that's one of the highest things he could do. Now, besides that blessing, if you read Boaz's interactions time and time again, you will notice that he values God. It's not just calling down blessings. He does it with the workers. He does it with Ruth over and over, and he does it through some of his other family members. But here's what's important. You see that he values God from the way that he treats others, from the way that he spends time with God, from the way that he has ethical standards in dealing with the proper protocol for redemption. Because when he goes to ask for Ruth to be the one he can redeem, he knows there's another family member he has to go check with first, and he does. And that family member does not want the responsibility of redeeming Ruth. So it tells us he follows the Torah as well. All of these things are huge markers. And in fact, throughout every one of Boaz's interactions, you will see that he obviously values God. That God is a big part of his life. And why is that so important for him to understand his value? How does that change his value? Most of us as guys walk around feeling worthless or like we don't have much value. But what do? We actually convince ourselves that we do. We try to pretend like we do. We try to pretend like we have that confidence. And the way that we do it so that no one else knows that we're struggling with our value or our worth is it comes out with machismo, bravado, narcissism. Those are all ways in which we cover up feeling like we don't have value or worth. Because if we can convince the world around us that we've got to figure out that we're confident in ourselves, then we don't have to worry whether they know we have value or not. But if you look at Boaz, he didn't have to do any of those things. Boaz was a man of prominence and of noble character because of the value he placed on his relationship with God. And he didn't have to walk around pretending all these other things because he knew he wasn't weak. He knew he wasn't worthless. He knew he wasn't any of those things, but he knew it because he knew God. Why? Because if we know God, if we value God, then we know we have value, guys. Hear me when I say that. I'm talking to the guys directly, to the husbands. If you know God, then you know, at least you should know, that you have value. Why? Because he sent his son to die for you. You may never have met him. You may not even know him very well. But if you learn who he is, the God of all the universe, the creator of all the universe, sent his son to die for you. God is not going to send his son to die for something worthless. Amen? Ladies, that goes for you too. If you define your worth and your value by the world's standards or how you feel about yourself, then I assure you, you're going to come up short. You're going to feel worthless. And you're going to carry that into your marriage. And when you carry that into your marriage, what you're doing is you're saying, well, I don't feel worth, so I'm going to hope I get it from my spouse. That's a lot of pressure on your spouse to make you feel like you have worth. If you want a good marriage, then know your worth in God. Because then you don't have to worry about anybody else telling you you're worthy, that you have value. Somebody's already done that, and they sent the greatest gift for you. They sent Christ to prove it, and he died for you. That's your worth. Now, how do we know that other people see that value? Well, what's great is because of who Boaz is, if you go back to all three of those interactions, you will notice something. It's not just Boaz asking blessing upon those people. Did you know that? Did you see that as we went through each one of those stories? In fact, in every one of those stories, there was a blessing put back on Boaz. They were willing to bless him back. In fact, his workers are the first one, right? He says, may the Lord bless you. Their response is, and the Lord bless you. Now, I got to tell you, they don't have to say that. Even in biblical times, even as a slave, they didn't have to say, may the Lord bless you. They could have just stayed silent. Hey, he's a good boss. Thanks for doing that. But what does that tell you? It tells you that they saw value in Boaz. They saw worth in him because they wanted to bless him back. Now, how many of us this week wanted to bless our boss back? Not with cuss words. How many of us wanted to look at our boss or our supervisor and say, may the Lord bless you because of the person they've been to us? How many of us wanted to do that? Probably not many. I'm guessing here. But I'm going to say that didn't cross many of our minds. That tells you that he is somebody of worth because they're willing to throw a blessing back on him. Now, if you look at Ruth's other interactions, her second interaction there in verses 12 through 13, you will notice that she calls him a refuge, under whose wings. But here's the big word. Notice what happens in verse 13. What does she say to him? My Lord. Guys, don't have that expectation, okay? Get rid of it. Don't. It's not going to happen, okay? Why does she call him my Lord? That is huge. She is not one of his hired servants. She doesn't have to call him my Lord. In some cultural context, it might be appropriate, but she doesn't even have to have any interaction with him, but she chooses to go back to this field if you will read her story. And as she does, she ends up saying to him, my Lord. In other words, what she's doing is an act of submission. She's willing to see him as her Lord, as someone over her. And it's an act of submission. Now, please hear me when I say this. This is not an act of submission in weakness. This is an act of submission in blessing. This isn't because she's weak. This is because she's choosing to say to him, I see you as someone who covers me, as someone who is a redeemer for me. And this is an act of blessing back to him, to give him that honor, to give him that title. This was an act of blessing. This is her response back. And in the last interaction, we see it again. He blesses her, but then she also, in chapter 3, verses 9 through 10, she also gives that blessing back to him. It's an act of respect. Once again, it's an honorable respect. Notice he says, because you haven't gone after the richer, younger ones. That's what he says. But that's an act of blessing. In her loyalty, she would have had other options. She could have left Naomi and started a whole new life and gone after other people. But again, she is choosing to be in this situation and give him this respect because she sees worth in him. But I don't believe it's because of his money. I don't believe it's just because of his prominence. I believe it's because she saw someone of value in every one of those situations. And it doesn't matter whether it's Ruth or the workers, they saw value in him, in Boaz. But I believe it's because Boaz saw value in God. So hear me, husbands, listen very closely when I say this. If you want to be a husband that is valued, then you need to be a husband that has values. Hear me when I say this. If you want to be valued as a husband, be a husband of values. What is it that you need to value? It's God. If you will value God, then you will know your worth, and it comes from God, nowhere else. No other cultural, worldly standards. It comes from no one else. And it doesn't matter if your spouse lets you down. It doesn't matter if people at work think you're a failure. It doesn't matter if your culture thinks you're a failure. If you value God, your worth comes from one place, and you never have to question that. Because God made you worth it. God made you worth it. So if you want that type of value, if you want to be seen that way, then you've got to value God. Now, I want to do a sidebar here and just give a warning. All the guys in the audience that may be looking for that relationship or haven't started it yet, or you're getting ready to maybe step into a marriage one day, I want to tell you that it is easy for you to begin to believe that your value comes from your job or your identity somewhere else. But one of the biggest ways we do it is through our relationships. If we have a woman that we're trying to date or we're trying to form a long-term relationship with, and we are trying to chase after her because we think that the status of that woman, whether it's her beauty, whether it is her riches, whether it is her power, we think that's going to tell the world that we have value. If you chase after her, but she will never see the value in you and your relationship with God, hear me when I say this, and I know you're not going to listen because I was that guy, but hear me when I say it because I've given you fair warning. She's not worth your time. She is not worth your time. If she cannot see the value in you as you chase after God, then she is not worth your time. I don't care if she meets any of those other markers, no matter how beautiful, rich, or powerful she is, that will not define your worth, even though the world tells you it will. She is not a status symbol that tells you whether you have worth. And even if she is, when she fails you, you will wonder where your worth comes from. Because believe it or not, ladies fail. And I have known couple after couple where the husband has made their wife the status of whether they're worthy or of value or not. And I want you to love your wives fiercely and as God instructed you to. But they do not define your value. They do not. Because if they do, when they fail, you will feel worthless. And it happens more times than you could ever know. But now, ladies, I'm going to speak to you for a second. This is a direct message to you. If you find a man who values God, then I want you to take time to remind him he's worth it. I know that sounds like a joke, and some of you go, yeah, okay, I'll do that. Yeah, maybe when you are worth it, I'll treat you that way. If you find a man in this world who values God, remind them that they're worth it. Because I see so many spouses who jump on the train of culture today and they tear down their husband. Men of God that I have seen torn down by their spouses. You say, well, I don't do that in public. No, but you do it with your friends. I've seen it. I've heard it. I've seen it here. I've seen it in my workplaces. I've seen it in my jobs. I have seen spouses that have torn down their husbands who are doing their best to chase after God, and they're not good enough because they forgot to do this. Or there they go again. I had to remind them again. Or they're worthless because they didn't do what I expected them to do. That's true. They may not do what you expected them to do, but my question is, are they doing what God expects them to do? Is that enough for you? Don't tear down your husbands. Don't make them feel any more worthless than culture already tells them they are. Because when you do that, and maybe it's just when it gets passed on to another friend and people say, have you heard about or how they treat them? Let me tell you something. When you're time to go back and say, maybe I started this train. I don't see my husband of worth. But when you're married apart because you haven't at all reminded them of their value, then maybe there's a time to question what you've put on them. Now, for both of you, I've talked to both of you. Together, when you find that person that has value in God, when you have that person, strengthen one another, encourage one another, and be. That's what God designed, for someone to make you a better version of yourself. If He's called you to marriage, that's what the partnership's about, making a better version of you. So when you find that person, cherish them. See value in them. Remind them that they're worth it. Encourage them when they don't see the value in God. But don't sell out for the value and the worth that the world tells you to look for. Stand on the premise that if you are a husband or a man that wants to have value, then be a man or a husband of values. That's what it means to find your worth, guys. That's what it means to be the husband God called you to be. Thankfully, because of Boaz, we get a great example of it. Let us go out and carry out that same example to live a life of value towards God. Got a couple of questions I want to ask you this morning to carry into your week. Number one, if I assess myself honestly, what consumerism am I guilty of within my marriage? What consumerism am I guilty of within my marriage? What is it that I think I am due? What selfishness am I holding on to that's causing a rift in my marriage? Number two, why do you think husbands/men have lost a sense of value over the years? I think this is a good discussion question. If you're going to go to extra rounds, I hope this is a really good discussion because I think there's a lot of things that have led to this. And number three, in what ways this week can you show that you value God and your life to others? Now, this doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Either side doesn't matter. What ways this week, I'm not talking about in the future, not just general ideas. I want you to get specific in your own life. How can you show others that you value God? Boaz went out to the fields and blessed his workers. He treated Ruth with respect and love and kindness and compassion. What is it that you can do this week specifically in your context that can show the world that you value God and who he is? Let's reflect on these things.